When your child is tantruming and the adults in the room are just not having it, it can be really, really stressful and can end us up in places where we're having long drawn out discussions with people who want to invalidate feelings or give us advice on how we should be handling things, whether that's helpful or not. And today I want to talk about what we can do in those moments to make it easier on ourselves and really emotionally healthy for our children. So my name's Jodie Thornton, and what we're going to talk about today is how we can frame things in a different way that make it easier for us to make decisions about what to do to support our children, because that's the primary priority in those moments. So if we think about an example, if your child is having a tantrum, whether it's developmentally appropriate, whether they're far past the age that society thinks that they should be tantruming, whatever is going on for them in that moment, you know that they're overwhelmed and they need emotional support and they need not to be shamed or have their feelings invalidated. But the adults in the room may be thinking that this is something that either your child needs to understand is not on, or perhaps that you, as the parent, should really understand that this is not acceptable. And I want us to really frame this a little bit differently to how many people will say. So a lot of people will give you advice about what to say to the adults and how to handle things. But I actually want to take a little bit of a deep dive into why these adults are behaving like this. And if we think about things from the perspective of somebody who has been taught that the only way for them to survive, to be connected, to be successful, to be a good person, if you think of any measure of success, the only way that you can do that is for you to either have no feelings or to only have feelings that everybody else involved agrees that that is logical and reasonable and acceptable. Right? And so if you imagine that this person has been raised in this way, that's been reinforced by every adult that's been around them, it's been reinforced by the school system, and it's being reinforced still to this day in their workplaces and their adult friendships. And then you put a child who has overwhelming feelings that they are lashing out. Perhaps they are just overwhelmed themselves. Perhaps they're hitting, kicking, screaming, ruining things. Like, they're doing all of these things. What we are looking for from a gentle or responsive parenting perspective, we're looking at what is this child's experience and how stressed they are and how much they need our support. The adult that is not coping with that tantrum, they are having the exact same emotional overwhelm that your child is having. And they may be better at repressing it and holding it in because they have a lot of practice, decades of practice, right? But if they are being nasty with their comments, if they are invalidating somebody else, if they're shaming somebody, if they're lecturing you as the parent, all of these reactions are from a place of deep emotional reactivity. And often this comes from a place of they are actually dysregulated themselves. Sometimes they're not actually dysregulated, they're really good at holding their emotions in check, but it's a fear place of like, if you do not help this child to learn, your child will not be okay, right? And so what we imagine is if they were able to be okay with this show of overwhelming emotion, that this would bring up for them a lot of their own baggage, a lot of the times that their feelings were invalidated. And if you imagine that this person, the adult that is uncomfortable with your child's tantrum, they are in this very moment telling themselves that their emotions are not okay. In that very, very moment, they are having a trauma response, right? And so none of this goes to say that we should change the way we handle our child, and we'll talk in a little bit about what decisions we want to make about how we support our child in this moment. But we want to really come at this from the perspective of this is not, if we think about the parents in our generation, often we have unpacked what have been the reasons it has not been okay for us to have our feelings invalidated and shamed, right? We've unpacked that part. We have not yet unpacked all of the baggage. We still have a lot of triggers and we still have a lot of issues that we're working through, or maybe we're on hold from working through. We're allowed to take breaks. But we know that we don't want to create an environment for our children that we grew up in. Right? If you look at the generation previous to this, they have not, and I'm speaking about this generationally, and it's not actually always generationally. Sometimes it's different cultures, sometimes it is different just how people have been raised, and so they can be even younger than us. It can be young adults that can be uncomfortable. But if we want to understand that these people have not yet even unpacked the fact that their emotions are okay and needed validation. And I am getting emotional just saying that out loud. Like, just thinking about these people who have had their emotions denied and repressed and just treated really harshly. They have internalized this, and day in, day out, they are telling themselves that they are not allowed to have their feelings. They're not allowed. Right? And so from that perspective, we can see why they have such a harsh reaction to a child having a tantrum, because they've got two things going on. One is their own emotional response. They do not know how to deal with someone else's overwhelm. They've got their own emotional response to the fact that they're holding in all their emotions day in, day out for decades. And so seeing somebody else be allowed to have those feelings, very stressful on their own like system, in terms of like, well, hang on, I've got all these feelings repressed too. And then a third thing is that they are fearful of what will happen, whether it might be your own child if they have a relationship with your child, or just in general. If we allowed people to have their feelings, the whole system would collapse, right? That is a big fear for a lot of adults that struggle with children having tantrums. That if we allow people to have their feelings, who even knows, will be completely out of control. And there's often comes with this idea that people are inherently bad. So this idea that if we're allowed to have our feelings, then a lot of people are going to do a lot of bad things because they feel uncomfortable, so they're justified, right? They haven't yet come across or haven't yet understood and really processed the idea that you can have your feelings and take into consideration other people's needs. And so you wouldn't act on impulses just because you're feeling uncomfortable, right? So if you think about it from this perspective, ultimately, you as the gentle or respectful or responsive parent, you're in a room with a child who doesn't know how to handle their feelings and an adult who also does not know how to handle their feelings. So effectively, you've got two people who are overwhelmed. Now, only one of those people you are responsible for. So we want to focus on your child. We're going to focus on what they need in this moment, but we're going to take into account that this other person is not able to handle their feelings. So that's our first thing, is to really understand that this adult who is not coping, they are actually having an emotional response and they don't know how to handle it. So we want to be really cognizant that they're not being mean or difficult on purpose. If you think about it through the lens of like a 2-year-old isn't being mean when they say things in a rude tone, it's the same thing when an adult says things in a rude tone. It's that they don't know how to process their feelings and make a constructive step towards what they need. Now, then we come to, what about the messages they're sending your child about feelings and tantrums and emotions and all of the things? What we want to do is we want to keep in mind that the messages your child picks up from you are going to be the strongest. So we want to have less fear about the messages our children get from other people. And part of the reason we want to do this is because ultimately there's a lot of talk in the parenting circles around how people are really disrespectful for children, towards children. But if you pay a lot of attention, people are just disrespectful. Like, honestly, it's like there's this set of unwritten rules about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And if you don't fit in with the acceptable rules in that setting, whether it's your family, your workplace, wherever you are, if you don't fit in with the rules of what's acceptable, you will be treated with disrespect. And it can come out in many different ways, but it is disrespect. And there's this piece of our children needing to learn that just because someone else is treating them a certain way about their feelings, that does not change that their feelings are valid, and it does not change that their needs are valid and their needs are okay, right? And so we want to have that idea of less fear around it, because this is something our children are going to need to get used to as they grow up, and hopefully they'll be part of the shift and change that we always validate people's emotions. But I can't see that being fixed before our children become adults, right? I think that this is something that's going to take some time. And so that our children need to be able to function and be an internalized version of their feelings are valid. And in the meantime, we are going to step into that space. We are going to make sure that our children hears from us routinely and emphatically that your feelings are valid, your needs are valid, and if something appears to be unreasonable or unfair to other people, then we have to go deeper. Because if it's at that surface level and it feels unreasonable or unfair or in any way irrational, then we haven't gone deep enough to really understand it. So that will be one thing that will really help to take the edge off of the impact of their feelings. But then the other part of this is that just because our children are going to have these experiences doesn't mean they need to have the experiences every time they come across it. And so you might want to set up a process where if your child's feeling overwhelmed, maybe you've got a plan with them that if they start to feel overwhelmed and they're not yet up to tantruming, they can come to you and you can go and do some chill out time, go for a walk around the block or go into another bedroom or something where you can avoid that overwhelm happening in the first place. But the other thing we can do is if your child is having a tantrum and the adults are saying things that are unhelpful, then what you might do is perhaps take your child into another space, right? Because as I say, just because we do want to get to the point where we're okay with other people saying invalidating or perhaps even shaming things, we don't need to get okay with that by exposing ourselves to every single example of that happening when it comes up. So maybe you can go into a different space, a different room, right? And that is often, that can also be being cognizant of the adults as well, which is my third point around the decisions you make on what to do. We want to prioritize your child first and foremost, but we want to be considerate of the adults too. And so if the adults are feeling upset by your child's tantrum, then removing your child to another space is actually respectful of both your child and the other adult. It means your child doesn't experience those shaming or invalidating comments, and or fewer of them. Sometimes you'll help them in another space, you bring them back, someone will make a comment or, has to be heard on how they think it should have gone differently. But you have reduced them, and particularly you reduce them when your child is really, really intensely upset. And it's also really considerate for those adults who are emotionally struggling with what's going on. Now, as I say, you're responsible only for your child, not for the other adults. So we don't want to prioritize the adult's feelings over the child. But in that case, like, removing the child is actually taking care of both the child and the adult at the same time. So the last thing I want to talk about is we often will have a compulsion to educate these people about how what they're doing is not okay. And my very first point about this is that if you were going to be successful in educating these people around how feelings are valid and that our children need to be allowed to have their feelings and that we need to not treat them in the way that has been the case in the past, if you were going to be successful in getting that message through, it would not be in this circumstance. One, a time where they are emotionally overwhelmed by your child's tantrum. Two, in a time where you are emotionally charged, so your delivery will come across, I'm sure this is not everybody, but most of us, our delivery will come across is that you are wrong, I am right, and my child will suffer if you don't change. That message is not going to get through. No matter what words you do, no matter how gentle you are, if the underlying energy is that you are creating an environment that is unhealthy for my child, that essentially that will just, those two concepts will be in conflict within that person. On the one hand, I understand the way the world works is that we get success and in all its forms by repressing our emotions. And you coming across saying, my child will not be okay, will not get the success unless they're allowed to have their emotions. There's no way for those two concepts to actually be unpacked and look for the truth behind it all. And so it's just not going to happen when you're in that charged space. The third thing, extremely unlikely that you're going to be able to help somebody to understand this in a public setting. So usually these things would happen in a family event or a friend's event where there's a lot of people. It's very unlikely that someone who needs to hear this kind of message will be able to take it in a really public setting. And lastly, if we go back to that first point about what this means for this person, if you are able to get through, if you're really able to get through that this child needs to be allowed to have their feelings because their feelings are always valid, imagine how much that shifts of that adult paradigm. Imagine how much that unpacks, how many wounds that brings up, how many experiences that they have rationalized as good for them when they start to understand that actually that wasn't good for them, that it wasn't okay, and that it's not okay that somebody wasn't there to support them through these experiences. That is a massive, massive thing to face. It's not something that's going to be achieved usually in one single conversation. And I have to say to you, I often work with parents at either end of the emotional spectrum. You might be surprised to know that the vast majority of them are in the let's deal with the feelings kind of end of the spectrum. But if we look at the other end of the spectrum where people are repressing their feelings, when I work with those parents, we don't start with feelings. We start with things like healthy boundaries. We start with things like, how do you look at the logic of what's going on rather than the feelings, right? And so if you're starting with these people, if you're truly wanting to help them shift and understand how they see things, ultimately you're going to need to come at it from a different angle than feelings are always valid. It's not going to land. Or if you do find a way for it to land, let me know, because I'd love to be able to get there more efficiently too. Now, then the last thing I want to say as well is that a lot of the vibe in parenting groups comes across as our children should only be expected to be in relationship with people who are 100% healthy. And ultimately, there are so few people, and I don't even know if there are any people who are 100% healthy, right? And so what we want to do is help our children to recognize that the relationships with the healthier people will be more rewarding, and we want them to focus on investing more heavily in those relationships. But we also want to recognize that we're not going to, in our relationships with other people, we're not going to say, you're being unhealthy right now, so I'm just going to have to not participate in this relationship. Now, obviously there are healthy boundaries to have when someone is in an unhealthy emotional space, but we want to have this idea that people are allowed to be imperfect, and we can have a healthy relationship between two imperfect people. And so the more your child sees you trying to control everybody that they are in relationship with, it gives them the idea that they should only have relationships with people who are perfect, which is not going to happen, right? So what we want to do instead is focus more on, I'm imperfect, but how am I going to show up healthy in this relationship? And so that is a whole different concept, right? So having said all of this, if you would like some help in the actual practical stages of helping your child calm down in the tantrum so that it's over with more quickly in these social settings, and also that you're not just validating your child for the purpose of having feelings, but you're actually validating the specific feelings that they're having and helping them get to the root cause of their feelings so that we can make a solution so they don't get so overwhelmed in the first place, then come and grab the webinar of mine called Supporting Kids Through Tantrums. And this webinar will give you how to use your body language, the choice of words that you use, and the tone of voice that you use to help your child to really regulate, so that you're not just waiting for the feelings to pass, you're actually helping them to process those feelings. You can grab that at jodithornton.com/tantrums, and hopefully that will be helpful. So I would really like, this has been such a big topic and we've covered a lot of ground. So if there's any questions you have or any concerns where you're worried about, hey, I know you said this, but that doesn't sit well with me, please feel free to email me at jody@jodithornton.com. I'd really like to hear any concerns or questions you have about this topic, because it's a really big one. I think it comes up for the vast majority of us as an issue to work through. So thank you so much for watching.